Senator from Ohio is recognized.
Well, first, I just got to hear the story of Jim Schmidt of Alaska. What an amazing American hero. And I thank Senator from Alaska, Senator Sullivan, for sharing that with all of us. I'm here on the floor tonight to talk about the growing epidemic of drug addiction and the issue that's occurring in my home state of Ohio and really all the states represented here in this chamber, and how we need to redouble our efforts. And it's a heartbreaking story because we were making so much progress prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, but now underneath the pandemic we have this epidemic that's growing. But before I get into that, I must talk first about what's going on this evening in the U.S. House of Representatives. Almost 3 months ago, beginning of August, we passed in this chamber bipartisan legislation to finally address our infrastructure shortfalls in this country. Presidents of both parties had been proposing it for many years. Congress had talked about it a lot, but we'd never been able to figure out a way forward. And so a group of 10 Republicans, 10 Democrats got together and said, we're going to grow this from the middle out and figure out how to address our infrastructure challenges and do so in a bipartisan way. We did that. The President of the United States, President Biden, supported our effort, and we were able to get that legislation across the floor here in the United States Senate. Not without some challenges and some changes, modifications, but we were able to do it because it was great for America, great for every state represented here, because it was repairing roads and bridges, but also our ports, our waterways, our water infrastructure, our infrastructure that's considered digital, which would be high-speed internet, make sure it is available to all of our citizens. So a lot of things that people had talked about for a long time, said they were for, but finally we were able to actually put it into writing and get it done. And it passed this chamber with a big vote, 69 votes. Rarely does something so significant pass this chamber with that kind of bipartisan support. Unfortunately, it has languished in the House of Representatives for almost 3 months, since early August. And the reason it has languished over there isn't because it doesn't have the votes. It's really more because people would like to use it as a hostage for something they want even more. And that's just wrong. And so tonight I urge my House colleagues, Democrat and Republican alike, to put aside the partisanship and focus on the substance of the bill and pass it. It's been held political hostage to something that House Democrats, particularly progressives in the House, want even more. It's not that they're opposed to infrastructure. They know this is needed. They know it's good for their constituents. It's good for our country. It's because they want even more to pass a massive new spending bill called sometimes the Build Back Better bill, sometimes the reconciliation bill, sometimes the $3.5 trillion tax and spend bill. But that is totally separate from infrastructure, but that's really what they want to pass. So they know that a lot of moderate Democrats support the infrastructure bill. They need those moderate Democrats to support the massive tax and spend bill. So in effect, they've held it hostage. They have not allowed the infrastructure bill to move unless they get commitments on the bill they really want, which is the tax and spend bill. I think that's just wrong. And so I urge the Speaker of the House and my colleagues in the House to go ahead and vote on that legislation this evening. I know there's been back and forth all day about what will happen. All I can say is it's the right thing to do for our country. You think about it, the infrastructure bill is exactly what we need right now. Not only do we have a long-term challenge everybody knows about and we've been talking about for literally decades, but for the problems we face right now in our economy, it's very effective. Inflation. Everybody's concerned about it, and they should be. Cost of gasoline at the pump is up about 42% this year compared to last year. It's really tough on middle-class families because although paychecks may have gone up a little bit, inflation's gone up higher. So it's essentially a tax on so many of our working families in this country. But everything's up. Food, clothing, furniture, everything. So inflation is driven in part by the stimulus spending. You remember back in March, there was a big bill, $1.9 trillion, and many of us said, including some Democrats, including famously Larry Summers, who's a former Democratic Secretary of Treasury for President Obama, and in the Clinton administration, said if you do this massive amount of spending, unprecedented amount of stimulus spending, you will drive up inflation because you're putting many more dollars into people's pockets, into the economy, at a time when the economy is already beginning to improve, and it will be chasing fewer and fewer goods, and that'll raise inflation. And that's exactly what has happened, which is bad for everybody, particularly, again, lower and middle income families that are seeing this hidden tax, really, on everything they buy, and again, taking away the power of their slight increase in wages that we've seen. In fact, when you look at the data, it looks like wages have actually gone down in the past year. They've gone down. So, because after inflation, wages are worth less. So that's where we are right now, and the infrastructure bill is actually counter-inflationary. Why do I say that? Because it doesn't invest in the way that the tax and spend bill invests. It's not about stimulus, it's about longer-term investments in hard capital assets. So the economists look at that, including conservative economists at the American Enterprise Institute, including Doug Holtz-Eakin, who's a former CBO director here and a more conservative economist, and they say, no, this actually will be counter-inflationary because you're investing long-term in these capital assets, creating jobs, making our economy more efficient, making it more productive, and therefore, in this instance now, where we have this high inflation, it's a good thing to do. Number two, we've had a lot of natural disasters in this country, particularly in the last year. About 1 out of every 3 Americans, apparently, lives in an area that has been subject to one of these natural disasters. It's the hurricanes, it's the floods, it's the wildfires. It's something that is affecting our country in a major way right now. We hear about it virtually every week. This legislation, the infrastructure bill, actually has provisions for resiliency to mitigate the damage from these natural disasters. So it is a well-timed bill in that sense as well. There's an historic commitment to ensuring that we're not just talking about climate change and natural disasters, but actually putting in place things that will protect communities from these natural disasters, whether it's forest fires, whether it's hurricanes, whether it's tornadoes, or other natural disasters. That's in this legislation, the infrastructure bill. And finally, what's one of the biggest issues we face right now in terms of our economy? The supply chain crisis. Go to a store in your community, as many of you have, and you'll see that the shelves are a lot barer than they used to be. And there's not much on the shelves because we got this supply chain problem, kind of a bottleneck. Well, this legislation helps in that regard because it provides funding for infrastructure, including our ports of entry, our land ports, but also our seaports that are now in a situation where they are jammed with more and more container ships, and yet they can't process them quickly enough. So what the experts tell me is that the $2 billion in the infrastructure bill will help to improve those facilities, improve their operation, improve the intermodal connections, in other words, the truck connections, the train connections to our ports, and help move along this supply chain issue that we're currently facing. The legislation helps with regard to freight rail. It helps with regard to our waterways, which carry a lot of freight in our country. So it's something that would be helpful in all 3 of these areas: inflation, natural disasters, and also our supply chain issues. At the same time, again, it's just needed because our infrastructure has fallen behind, particularly fallen behind other countries. And therefore, making our economy more efficient, more productive is a good thing. Again, that's why it got 69 votes here in the United States Senate, and why we need to pass it. It is totally different from the tax and spend reconciliation bill, which again is massive new spending, massive tax increases, which will add to inflation, and at a time when we have such high debts and deficits, it will add to our record level of debt and deficit. Its large tax increases will hurt our economy at a time when we cannot afford it. We just got the numbers in from the economic growth in the last quarter. They just came in today, 0.5% growth. Very disappointing. Well below expectations. So we know economic growth is slowing. We know inflation is rising. We know that this is not the time for us to put forward this kind of legislation because it will aggravate the inflationary pressures, but it also causes us at a time of debt and deficits to see big increases in spending. And finally, again, at a time when our economy is unfortunately not performing the way we would like to see it, it's slowing down. It's the worst economic quarter we've had since 2000. We need to be sure we're not adding new taxes to our economy at this time. So the timing is bad. By the way, the infrastructure bill has no new tax increases. The infrastructure bill is not about immediate spending. It's about long-term spending over 5, 10, 15 years for capital assets. Again, counter-inflationary. So they are very different proposals, aren't they? I call on my colleagues in the House tonight to pass this legislation. Get the infrastructure bill done. Don't hold it hostage to something else. That's not how we operate. Do the right thing for your constituents and for our country. The other focus that I had tonight was on our opioid and more broadly drug addiction crisis we face in this country. And unfortunately, at a time with the pandemic causing huge health care problems, that has distracted a lot of our attention, understandably. But underneath that pandemic, there has been this epidemic that has been growing. And that's, again, this addiction issue. Back in 2018, we saw a reduction in addiction and specifically in the way it's typically measured, which is the number of overdose deaths that occur in our states. It was great news, a 22% decrease in overdose deaths in my home state of Ohio, after decades of increases every single year. 22% reduction in 1 year. 2019 was also a good year, where we saw significant success in getting people into treatment, getting people into recovery, reducing the use of drugs through prevention, all the things that we have been wanting to do. So much of that came from work that was done in this chamber, because we did enact new legislation and provided billions of more dollars for prevention, for treatment, for recovery. And we had a lot of great activity going on at the state level and at our local levels as well, building on that. We had more Narcan being provided to our communities, which is this miracle drug that reverses the effects of an overdose. We had very good success in getting more people not just into treatment, but into longer-term recovery where there's a greater chance of them succeeding and not relapsing. We did that through some legislation called the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, bipartisan legislation passed here in this chamber. Senator Whitehouse joined with me on that as the co-authors, and then we also passed additional legislation to give more money directly to the states. And we found that we were, again, making progress. And then the pandemic hit. Unfortunately, we now know from the latest data from the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, that under the cover of this pandemic, the drug epidemic has not only not gone away, it's actually gotten much worse. Overdose deaths rose by nearly 30% between March 2020 and March 2021, the latest year for which we have data. 30% increase in overdose deaths. This is very discouraging and heartbreaking, really, because that means much more devastation for our communities, families being broken apart, people not being able to achieve their God-given ability in life, thousands more being lost, 96,779 more individuals, moms and dads, sons and daughters, friends and loved ones lost their lives to overdose deaths during that year-long period, the most recent year that we have data for. It's the worst year we've had in the history of our country in terms of overdose deaths. Again, we've been rightfully focused on COVID-19, but particularly as the pandemic, the COVID pandemic is beginning to get better, the Delta variant finally beginning to affect our communities less, we have got to refocus ourselves on this addiction issue. If we don't do it, we're going to continue to see this tragic epidemic take away more lives. In 47 states and the District of Columbia, the overdose rate went up during this last year, including a 26% increase in my home state of Ohio. In some states, by the way, the increase was as high as 85%. And I know the members of the Senate who represent those states are well aware of that and would join me in saying, we've got to figure out a way. We've got to figure out a way. So what is the way forward? Well, part of it is to getting back to what we know works. the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act and a bill called the 21st Century Cures Act, both signed into law in 2016, again, provided billions of new dollars for prevention, for treatment, for longer-term recovery, for Narcan to help our first responders. And that worked, and we made progress. So let's get back to that and redouble our efforts there. But we need to do more. And we have new legislation we've introduced. We think we'll do that. It's called the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act 2.0. I'm sorry, 3.0. We've already done the first bill and 2.0. Now we're at 3.0. And it provides additional help, but also has some new provisions in addition to funding those that we know work. And that's extremely important as well. By the way, in these overdose deaths, we know that increasingly it's synthetic opioids that is causing the deadly outcome. Fentanyl in particular, which is a synthetic form of heroin or other opioids that for a long time was being produced in China and then sent to our shores, and this poison was coming into our communities by our own U.S. Postal Service. So several years ago, we wrote legislation to deal with that called the STOP Act. And it's actually been quite effective to keep these drugs from coming in through the United States mail system. At that time, our mail system didn't provide the kind of screening that the private carriers did, like FedEx or UPS or DHL. And so people who were traffickers chose to use our own postal service. Maddening. And they were doing it successfully. But it's kind of like whack-a-mole. Once we dealt with the STOP Act and dealt with the fentanyl coming in from China directly through the mail system, it started to show up where? Through our southern border. So today, what the experts will tell you is this deadly fentanyl is coming in primarily through the U.S.-Mexico border. It is cheaper than ever, very inexpensive. Sometimes it's produced in Mexico using precursors that come from China. It's being pressed into pills often, so people don't know that it's fentanyl. The pill may be Xanax. The pill may be Percocet. People think they're getting pain relief or anxiety relief when in fact they're getting fentanyl. And the tragic result of that is, again, more and more overdose deaths. We had a roundtable discussion recently where we talked about the issue of the border and what was happening and the fact that so many people now are coming across the border, but also so much contraband, including these drugs. And we had a witness whose name was Virginia Krieger. This was last week. Virginia told us her very tragic story about her daughter who thought she was taking a Percocet for pain because that's what the pill said. And she died of an overdose. And it was determined after the fact that, in fact, she had died of fentanyl because some evil scientist, perhaps in Mexico, had pressed these pills, made these pills, probably to try to get her addicted to this powerful drug fentanyl. And in fact, she had ingested it, taken it, and it had caused her to overdose and die. Virginia, God bless her, has taken the death of her daughter, Tiffany Leigh Robertson, and channeled that grief into something positive, which is she's going out to the schools now and talking to young people. See, our pages are here tonight, and saying every drug, every pill that's not from a pharmacy that you might find on the streets is potentially deadly. It can kill you. So be cautious. Don't ever take a pill if you don't know that it's coming from a pharmacy, that it is what it says it is. My heart goes out to Virginia, her family, and all those who have lost loved ones to these deadly substances. We need to be sure that we reduce the supply of these drugs, and we also do much more in terms of the demand reduction. One way we can start to address the supply of fentanyl and other synthetic opioids is to make sure that they're illegal. That might seem obvious to you, but we've had a hard time here in this country dealing with this issue because, think about it, it's a synthetic form of an opioid which can be changed by one of these evil scientists fairly easily. Maybe just one molecule changes, and suddenly it's not on the list of controlled substances. and not illegal. So, in order to avoid this problem and be sure that people are properly prosecuted for illegal drugs, we are putting together legislation and trying to pass it that ensures that there is a permanent classification of these drugs as being illegal. The Drug Enforcement Agency back in 2018 used its authority to temporarily classify all fentanyl-related drugs, all of them as Schedule I substances, meaning illegal at the highest level, which allows law enforcement to aggressively intercept and destroy those substances. Unfortunately, that was only temporary. So that designation needs to be made permanent. We have successfully extended the temporary designation a few times here, but it's going to expire again at the end of January. So in just a couple months, once again, we'll have an expiration of that designation. Until we make these fentanyl-related drugs permanently illegal, law enforcement will not have the certainty they need to go after the criminals moving these deadly substances, and fewer lives will be lost. The legislation is called the Fight Fentanyl Act. It's bipartisan. I introduced it with Senator Manchin, and again, it fixes this problem by permanently classifying these drugs that are fentanyl-related as Schedule I. It also gives our law enforcement the certainty they need to go after synthetic opioids in all forms and show we are committed to addressing the threat posed by this particularly dangerous class of drugs. So my hope is my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will work with us to get this done before the end of January. There's no reason we should do it at the last minute. We should provide that certainty and predictability. At the same time, I continue to believe that the most progress can be made on the demand side. So yes, we need to do a better job at the southern border. It's outrageous what's happening now. So many drugs are coming across at record levels. The apprehensions of fentanyl are at record levels. In fact, enough fentanyl has been apprehended this year alone to kill every man, woman, and child in America. That's how deadly the drug is. But ultimately, we have to deal with the demand for that drug in this country. As long as we have this insatiable demand, it's going to be difficult to stop it through the supply side or even making these drugs illegal. So that's why I think we need new legislation to build on the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act, to build on what we've done previously, and this CARA 3.0 bill we've introduced with Senator Whitehouse can help on that. It does so by addressing three important areas: research and education, treatment and recovery, and criminal justice reform. First, it will bolster our work to prevent drug abuse before it happens through funding for research and education. To me, it's time for a national awareness campaign. It would be money well spent, and I believe we could use the money that we would appropriate here to leverage a lot more private interest in this and get the private companies, like the pharmaceutical companies, to step forward and to help us in a true national drug awareness campaign. Second, research and development. We need to have better pain relief drugs in this country. We're still relying on things like Percocet, as I mentioned, and other opioids, prescription forms, that we've been relying on for decades. It's time to actually move forward with the research and development of alternative pain treatments that don't lead to addiction, as opioids do. There's been some progress there, but not nearly enough, and it needs more help. Second, in terms of treating substance abuse, our bill builds on what works by doubling down on proven, evidence-based addiction treatment methods while expanding treatment options for groups particularly vulnerable to addiction, including young people, new and expecting moms, rural communities, communities of color. And it will make permanent the current expanded telehealth options for addiction treatment that were temporarily created in response to the social distancing required by COVID-19. This is an exciting opportunity because it turns out during COVID-19, when we had to rely more on telehealth, there was actually a lot of success in getting people into treatment. Now, it wasn't as good as having your recovery coach there with you and your perhaps other recovering addicts with you to give you the support you need. But for some people who couldn't travel because of the COVID-19 restrictions and now perhaps can't travel for other reasons, telehealth is something that was determined to be quite successful in many cases. So we should continue that. And we have to change laws to do that because it's about whether that would be reimbursed, particularly under Medicaid and Medicare. CARE 3.0 will also bolster the recovery options for individuals working to put addiction behind them through funding to support recovery support networks. It will enable physicians to provide medication-assisted treatment like methadone to a greater number of patients and change the law to allow those drugs to be prescribed via telehealth for greater ease of access. So part of the telehealth we're looking for is if you have a medication-assisted treatment plan, that you can use telehealth, in other words, over the internet, to be able to get your prescription. There needs to be safeguards in that. You need to be sure that the first time a prescription is given, that there is a face-to-face contact, and make sure that it's not being abused. But this can be quite helpful. Finally, CARE 3.0 reforms our criminal justice system to ensure that those struggling with addiction, including our veterans, are treated with fairness and compassion by the law, putting them on a path to recovery instead of a downward spiral of substance abuse. When someone comes out of one of our prisons or jails and comes out as an addict and there's not treatment provided, way too often that person, of course, relapses and begins to use again, gets back into criminal activity, and is right back in the criminal justice system. That doesn't help anybody. It certainly doesn't help the taxpayer because the cost is $30,000, $35,000, probably more at the federal level to incarcerate someone. And when they get out, they're just creating more crimes, it's creating more crime in the community. So it's worth putting some emphasis on treatment while someone's in prison if they are suffering from addiction, and certainly when they get out, getting them into treatment and recovery programs to get them back on their feet. And by the way, we need these people in our workforce right now. We've always needed them, but we particularly do now. So this is a win-win for our economy, certainly for the addict. CARE and CARE 2.0 have given states and local communities new resources and authorities to make a real difference in our states. CARE 3.0, this new bill, renews and strengthens those programs, and given the recent spike in addiction, provides a significant boost in funding as well. When added with existing CARE programs that are authorized through 2023, we would be investing over $1 billion per year to address the epidemic, putting us on a path toward a brighter future, free from addiction. It's money well spent, in my view. It's necessary. Again, it's going to help to bring our families back together, get people back to work, ensure that our communities are not being devastated by crime that's committed in relation to these drug issues. I believe these two bills, the Fight Fentanyl Act we talked about and CARE 3.0, will make a difference in addressing this crisis of addiction our country now faces that has been made even worse during the time of the pandemic. A lot of our victims of this addiction crisis are suffering in silence. I urge my colleagues, let's act now. Let's bring this to the light. Let's allow more people to get into treatment, longer-term recovery. Let's be sure that we are making fentanyl illegal in all of its forms. Let's, without delay, go to work to once again do what we know works, because we turned the tide on addiction. We began to turn it in 2018, 2019. Let's get back to that, which will save lives and give so many more Americans the ability to achieve their God-given potential. I yield back my time.